The tension in Fairmont Crest had been building for weeks, but no one, not even those closest to the chaos, could have predicted just how violently everything would unravel the night Leah finally snapped, because what began as whispered suspicions, buried betrayals, and quiet manipulations exploded into a moment that would permanently alter every life it touched, especially Smitty's, who had spent so long believing he understood the people around him, believing he could navigate the lies and still come out with his integrity intact, only to find himself staring down the barrel of a gun held by someone he once trusted more than anyone else. Leah had always been complicated, layered in a way that made people underestimate her, mistaking her silence for weakness and her patience for submission. But beneath that carefully controlled exterior had always been a storm, one fueled by secrets she had carried for far too long. Secrets tied to power, betrayal, and a past that refused to stay buried. And as she stood there in the dim light of Smitty's living room, her hands trembling but her eyes unwavering, it became painfully clear that this was not a moment of impulse but the culmination of everything she had endured, everything she believed had been stolen from her, and everything she was now determined to reclaim, no matter the cost. Smitty, caught completely off guard, could barely process what was happening, his mind racing through every possible explanation, every misunderstanding that could have led to this, his voice unsteady as he tried to reach her, to remind her of who they were to each other, of the history they shared. But Leah's expression didn't soften, didn't waver, because in her mind, that history had already been rewritten by betrayal, by the realization that Smitty had been keeping secrets of his own, secrets that tied him to people and events that had caused her unimaginable pain. And in that moment, she wasn't seeing the man she once cared about. She was seeing a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. The argument that followed was sharp, emotional, and deeply revealing, with accusations flying back and forth like weapons, each word cutting deeper than the last, exposing truths that neither of them had been willing to confront until now. Smitty insisting that whatever Leah thought she knew, she didn't have the full story, that there were reasons for his actions, reasons he had been trying to protect her from, but Leah was beyond listening, beyond reason, because from her perspective, every explanation sounded like another lie, another attempt to manipulate her into staying quiet, into accepting a version of reality that no longer made sense to her. And as the intensity of the moment escalated, the distance between them, both physical and emotional, seemed to shrink into something dangerously combustible. Outside, the world continued as if nothing was wrong, the quiet hum of the neighborhood masking the storm brewing. Inside that house, but inside, everything had narrowed down to a single, irreversible choice, and as Leah's grip tightened on the gun, her voice dropped to a near whisper, one that carried more weight than any scream ever could, demanding the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Smitty realizing in that instant that this was no longer about convincing her. This was about survival, about finding the one thing he could say that might break through the wall she had built around herself. But the tragedy of the situation was that the truth, the real truth, was more complicated and more devastating than either of them had fully acknowledged. And as he began to speak, to finally lay everything bare, it was already too late, because Leah had already made up her mind about who he was and what he had done. The gunshot, when it came, shattered the silence with a deafening finality, echoing through the room and leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unreal, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. Smitty collapsing to the floor, the shock evident on his face more than the pain, his body struggling to process the sudden violence that had been inflicted upon it, while Leah stood frozen, the reality of her actions crashing over her in waves, the anger that had driven her now giving way to something far more complicated, far more terrifying, because no matter how justified she had felt in that moment, no matter how deeply she believed she had been wronged, there was no undoing what had just happened. The aftermath unfolded in fragments, in panicked breaths and unsteady movements, Leah dropping the gun as if it had burned her, her hands shaking as she took a step back, then another, her mind racing with the implications of what she had done, the consequences that were now inevitable, while Smitty, barely conscious, fought to stay awake, to hold on long enough to understand why, to make sense of how everything had spiraled so completely out of control, and in those final moments before help arrived, because in a place like Fairmont Crest, nothing stayed hidden for long. The truth lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved, because even now, even after the shot had been fired, there were still secrets left untold, still pieces of the story missing, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, signaling the arrival of a reality neither of them could escape, the question that remained was not just whether Smitty would survive, but whether the truth, when it finally came to light, would justify Leah's actions or condemn her in a way she could never recover from, because in the world they lived in, where loyalty was fragile and betrayal often wore a familiar face, the line between victim and villain was never as clear as it seemed, and the consequences of crossing that line would ripple far beyond this single, devastating moment, affecting everyone connected to them in ways they had yet to imagine. The sirens grew louder with each passing second, slicing through the heavy stillness that had settled over the house like a suffocating blanket, and Leah's heart pounded so violently in her chest that it felt as though it might betray her before anyone else could, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts as she stared at Smitty's motionless form sprawled across the floor. The reality of what she had done refusing to fully settle in, yet clawing at the edges of her consciousness, demanding acknowledgement, demanding accountability, while somewhere deep inside her, a voice, once steady and rational, had begun to fracture under the weight of panic and regret, urging her to move, to run, to fix something that could never truly be fixed, but her legs felt rooted in place, as if the house itself had claimed her as part of the scene, a silent witness turned perpetrator in a tragedy that would soon consume them both. Smitty, fighting against the darkness, threatening to pull him under, let out a strained, barely audible groan, a fragile sign of life that snapped Leah back into motion, her instincts warring with each other as she dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands hovering uselessly over his body before finally pressing against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, her fingers quickly becoming slick with blood, the warmth of it shocking her in a way nothing else had yet, because it made everything undeniably real, made it impossible to retreat into denial or justification, and as she leaned closer, her voice breaking as she called his name, there was a flicker of something in Smitty's eyes, pain, confusion, but also something softer, something that cut deeper than any accusation ever could, because it wasn't anger she saw reflected there, but heartbreak. Why? He managed to whisper, the word fragile and incomplete, but heavy with meaning, and Leah felt it hit her like a physical blow, her mind scrambling to find an answer that made sense, an explanation that could bridge the impossible gap between what she had believed moments ago and what she was now confronted with. But the words that had once felt so certain, so justified, now seemed hollow, distorted by the irreversible consequences of her actions, and for the first time since she had pulled the trigger, doubt crept in, insidious and relentless, forcing her to question whether she had truly known the truth at all or if she had simply been reacting to a version of it. Shaped by fear and manipulation, the front door burst open moments later, the arrival of neighbors drawn by the gunshot and the escalating sirens breaking whatever fragile isolation had existed, their shocked gasps and hurried voices filling the space as they took in the scene before them, someone shouting for towels, someone else already on the phone with emergency services despite the sirens that now screamed just outside, and Leah, covered in blood that wasn't hers, looked up at them with wide, uncomprehending eyes, as if she were seeing the world from a distance, detached from her own body, from her own choices, unable to reconcile the person she had been just minutes ago with the one she had become. When the paramedics rushed in, their movements were swift, practiced, efficient in a way that contrasted sharply with the chaos of emotions swirling around them. Their focus entirely on Smitty as they assessed his condition, issued rapid instructions, and began the urgent work of stabilizing him, pushing Leah aside in the process, not out of cruelty but necessity, and as she stumbled back, her hands still stained, her mind still reeling, she felt the first true wave of consequences crash over her, because in that moment, she was no longer just someone who had made a terrible mistake. She was a suspect, a headline waiting to happen, a story that would be told and retold without her control. And as the police arrived just seconds behind the paramedics, their presence, bringing with it a different kind of tension, one rooted in authority and inevitability, Leah knew there would be no escaping what came next. The questions started immediately, sharp and direct, cutting through the haze that had settled over her, an officer carefully but firmly guiding her away from the immediate scene, asking what happened, who else was involved, whether the weapon was still in the house. And Leah's responses came out fragmented, inconsistent, her voice unsteady as she tried to piece together a narrative that even she no longer fully believed, her earlier certainty unraveling with every passing second, replaced by a growing awareness that the situation was far more complicated than she had allowed herself to see, that the truth she had acted on might have been incomplete or even manipulated, and that realization brought with it a crushing weight of guilt that threatened to consume her entirely. Meanwhile, as Smitty was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and rushed out toward the waiting ambulance, his condition remained uncertain, the paramedics working tirelessly to keep him stable, their urgency underscoring just how critical his injuries were. And as the doors of the ambulance slammed shut and it sped away into the night, carrying with it not just a wounded man but the fragile thread of hope that he might survive, everyone left behind was forced to confront the gravity of what had just unfolded, none more so than Leah, who stood there as the flashing lights painted everything in harsh, unforgiving colors, her future shifting with every passing moment. At the hospital, the situation only grew more intense, the emergency room becoming the next stage for a drama that refused to slow down, doctors and nurses moving with focused precision as they fought to save Smitty's life, while outside in the waiting area, the ripple effects of the shooting began to spread, friends, family, and associates arriving one by one, each bringing their own questions, their own fears, and their own pieces of a puzzle that was far from complete, because as more information began to surface, it became clear that the conflict between Leah and Smitty had deeper roots than anyone had initially realized, connections to other players, other secrets, and other betrayals that extended far beyond a single confrontation in a living room. Back at the scene, investigators worked methodically, documenting every detail, collecting evidence, reconstructing the sequence of events with a level of detachment that contrasted sharply with the emotional turmoil of those involved. And as Leah was finally placed in the back of a police car, not yet fully processed but no longer free to leave, she stared out at the house that had once hours blurred into something unrecognizable after the ambulance disappeared down the hospital corridor, its flashing lights swallowed by the night, and inside Fairmont Crest, the world that Leah had once moved through with confidence now felt like a collapsing structure with no stable ground left beneath it, every conversation around her turning into fragments of accusation, shock, and disbelief as word of the shooting spread faster than anyone could control. By the time Smitty reached the emergency room, his condition had already been classified as critical, and the medical team wasted no time rushing him into surgery, leaving behind a stunned silence in the waiting area, where people who had once shared casual greetings and polite smiles now sat in rigid uncertainty, each of them replaying what little they knew, trying to reconstruct how things could have spiraled so violently. While Leah sat in a separate holding space under police supervision, her wrists now restrained not with brutality but procedure, the cold metal of the cuffs serving as a constant reminder that whatever she believed she had been doing in that moment of rage or fear or desperation no longer mattered in the same way, because the law had already begun to define the shape of her reality. She kept seeing Smitty's face in flashes, his confusion, his pain, that final question that had not been answered, and it haunted her more than the gunshot itself, because questions had always been easier to ignore than consequences until now. In her mind, she tried to reconstruct the argument again and again, searching for the exact point where everything broke, where words stopped being communication and became weapons, but the more she replayed it, the less certain she became about her own certainty, as if the memory itself had begun to shift under pressure, revealing gaps she hadn't noticed before. Inconsistencies she had once rationalized away. An officer entered the room periodically, asking her to repeat her statement, and each time she did, her voice weakened, not from strategy but from doubt, because the story she had believed so firmly just hours ago now felt fragile, incomplete, and possibly wrong in ways she was not yet ready to fully admit. In the hospital, the atmosphere was no less volatile, though it wore the mask of professionalism. Doctors moved with controlled urgency, their voices clipped and focused as they fought to stabilize Smitty, whose condition had become increasingly precarious due to blood loss and shock, and every minute that passed felt like a negotiation between survival and surrender, a balance that could tilt in either direction without warning. Outside the operating room, familiar faces began to arrive. Friends, colleagues, people who had no idea they were walking into a moment that would redefine their understanding of everyone involved, each one stopping short at the sight of police presence and the tense expressions of hospital staff who offered no comfort, only instructions to wait. Among them, conversations formed in hushed tones, theories emerging like fragile attempts to impose order on chaos, some insisting Leah had snapped, others whispering that Smitty had been involved in something deeper, something hidden, something dangerous, and in that vacuum of confirmed truth, speculation grew wild, feeding on fear and incomplete knowledge. Back at the station, Leah was finally allowed a brief moment without questioning, though there was no sense of relief in it, only stillness that felt heavier than interrogation. She stared at her hands, now cleaned but still feeling stained, as if the memory of what she had done had seeped beneath the skin itself, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had avoided since the moment of the shooting, that she might have been manipulated, that the certainty she had acted on might have been constructed by someone else's lies rather than her own understanding. But even that thought did not absolve her, because regardless of how the truth had been shaped, it was her finger on the trigger, her decision in that final irreversible second, and that realization pressed down on her with crushing clarity. The interrogation resumed later, more structured now, more precise, and with it came new details, questions about prior conversations, messages, interactions between her and Smitty in the days leading up to the shooting, and as those threads were pulled, a more complicated picture began to emerge, one that included missing context, unresolved conflicts, and third parties whose influence had not yet been fully uncovered. Leah's answers became slower, more uncertain, not because she was hiding anything, but because she was no longer sure where interpretation ended and fact began, and that uncertainty frightened her more than anything else. By the time dawn approached, the hospital received a critical update. Smitty had survived the surgery, but his condition remained unstable, and the next 24 hours would determine everything. The news spread quickly through those waiting, bringing both relief and renewed anxiety, because survival was not the same as recovery, and everyone understood that even if Smitty lived, nothing about his life, or Leah's, would return to what it had been before. And as the first light of morning filtered through the windows of Fairmont Crest, illuminating a community that had not yet fully processed the violence that had unfolded within it, one truth had already become undeniable. Whatever had led to that moment in Smitty's living room was far from over, because beneath the shooting, beneath the accusations and the police reports and the hospital monitors, something deeper was still unresolved, secrets that had not yet surfaced, motives that had not yet been fully exposed, and consequences that were only just beginning to unfold, ensuring that when the truth finally came, it would not bring peace, but a new and even more dangerous kind of reckoning.